building of the participation, the transformation of individual lives and the lives of, of communities.
So, what do women bring to peace building that maybe men generally don't?
Well, I think what so many of the leading scholars in this area tell us is that women bring a whole range of experiences and understandings about day to day lived realities that, if they're not at the table, are absent. Issues around um, the perpetration of violence against, in particular, against against women and children, in particular, the inequitable distribution of resources when fighting. When fighting stops, the building of institutions that do not take account of a whole range of diverse experiences, not just actually about gender and gendered identities, but go well beyond gender. The kinds of things that we would talk about in relation to, equity and diversity and inclusion of a whole range of people, that if they are left behind, the peace is just so much harder to hold, that the institutions being built actually aren't fit for purpose because they cannot respond to all of the people, in a given community, in a given society. So those lived experiences of what does it mean to try and get the day-to-day needs for your family? What does it mean in relation to try and access, education or work, or all of the institutions that enable a community to transition away from war? If those voices aren't there, the peace that is built is only ever partial.
Is it hard to get women to the table?
I think it's hard to get the door open so women can reach the table.
Mm.
What we see, particularly across the Indo-Pacific, are, incredibly uh, impressive women leaders of organisations that are delivering on the ground, but also, uh, higher level, higher order organisations, if you like, as well. However, the ways that the table has been assembled in the room,
Mm.
the number of seats at the table, and the kinds of expectations for who gets the first crack at filling those seats, has meant that it's not been that there haven't been women, that there have not been a conscious effort to actually let them through the door, to actually reach that table.
Former Australian Senator Natasha Stott Despoja AO served as Australia's ambassador for women and girls from 2013 to 2016.
Natasha Stott Despoja, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
We know that in times of conflict, violence and the effects of conflict seem to be much more experienced by women and children. And yet so often they're not invited to the table to talk about the peace process or give their suggestions on how it should work or what's most needed. Why do you think they're not included in these conversations?
Well, your point's really pertinent right now, isn't it? I mean, you only have to look at the images that emanating from, obviously, the unfolding humanitarian conflict and awful situation in Ukraine, or more recently in places like Syria and, of course, Afghanistan. You don't see women around the table. In fact, obviously, Afghanistan, you don't see women at really any table. It's there's a cabinet that's devoid of women. There are ministers that ministry that doesn't include women. And obviously there's a lot to unpack in that. But certainly, particularly with the changing nature of warfare, so increasingly where civilians are targets now, not just collateral, but targets, we've seen that there is a unique and disproportionate effect on women and children, or women and girls, when it comes to conflict, whether that's violence generally or whether it's sexual violence specifically. So why aren't women at that table? Well, I suspect you know that answer as well, the sense of male-dominated institutions that we've seen in all countries, regardless of our developed or developing nature. So there's a lack of history, there's a lack of opportunity, and there's also just the issue of power and the fact that very few people relinquish power. And in most cases, men are not sharing that power at the decision-making table, even if, and this is the extraordinary part of it, even if it was to the benefit of their country or community, or indeed, as we've seen, there is an inextricable link between success in peace agreements and peace processes when women are reflected and represented at the table.
What do you think will be the future of conflict if women continue to be excluded from the table where these decisions and solutions are discussed?
Oh, well, I think it's a predictably negative one. There's one statistic I really like, and it's I think it's applicable to any country or community, but they've actually shown that if you decrease the percentage of women in a parliament by 5%, you actually see that country is 5 times more likely to use military intervention when it comes to resolving international disputes. And that is just in my head at the moment constantly for obvious reasons.
Let me interrupt. I want to make sure I heard that figure correctly. Decrease the number by 5%, and the increase is 5 times the amount.
Indeed. So that I'm going to check all my stats for you, but that's the one that's haunting me at the moment. But I guess the more reliable and other statistics, which are very clear, show that peace agreements are more likely to be robust, sustainable, long term, basically more successful if women are involved in that process, not only in the decision making and the negotiating, but ensuring that the issue and the concerns affecting women are included in those processes. So when you ask, what's the future? Well, the future is pretty bleak unless we resolve some of these issues. And I would say across the board, not including, the talents of half your population, whether it's in peacekeeping, whether it's in negotiations, whether it's in the general, running of your country, when we know that more women in leadership roles does lead to, maintenance of infrastructure that's better, better distribution of public resources, really has a beneficial effect right down to measures as simple as profit and loss. So the future is bleak unless we really start to grapple with this. And as you know, and something that you've talked about often and passionately, it's got to be a reflection that includes all our diversity and difference. It's got to be intersectional. So we can't leave people behind, but certainly we've left women behind for too long.
What's your take on why there is that staggering difference? If you decrease the number of women by just 5%, the likelihood of going to war or conflict increases 5 times. How do you interpret why that happens?
It's a really good question because it's a hard one, isn't it? Does it mean that women are, have an ameliorating effect on
Mm.
parliaments and countries? Well, not necessarily, although I'm sure there are many people who would sort of take a biological sort of determinist approach to that says, well, we're mothers and we're more caring and we're this and we're that. And arguably, of course, there's some element of certainly the fact that women, and we know this from research, that women tend to reinvest more, whether they're as leaders in community or in parliaments, etc. They tend to invest more in issues that affect women and children. So there's definitely a community-minded element in that. We know that more women in those leadership roles actually does lead to efforts that better address the issue of violence against women. So I think that there is this, whether it's innate or otherwise, we know that women and diversity generally means you have better approaches, different approaches. In terms of whether or not it means we're inherently peacekeepers, I don't know. I like to think so. But the reality is diversity is good for any decision-making institution, and that has to include women, of course.
Here's Sharon Pickering. Do you have examples of communities or cities or countries that have included women in the decision making that have really demonstrated successful outcomes in terms of peace building? And maybe then examples of the opposite as well, when women haven't been included and there's been terrible knock-on effects.
The one example I would give you is the absence of that. And I think this is what we see. This is what we see in Afghanistan right now. We were really fortunate at Monash a few years ago where we hosted a senior group of female Afghan leaders who came to talk to us, where it had been very much engaged in working through the peace process, had tried to be part of that. But as those negotiations shifted under Trump's leadership, they were in essence cut out. They did not get anywhere near the space at the table that we would expect, given all the learnings that we've had from other places, and that was for a whole host of reasons. But there's a direct correlation between that and the fact that there are no girl children in schools right now in Afghanistan. You know, you think of that profound peace. I think we're up to nearly day 90 of girls not being in schools with no commitment, with no sense of when that can ever change. Now, to me, it is implausible that a peace would have been brokered with a decent proportion of women at the table that would have got that outcome. It's implausible to me that would have occurred, and it has. And for every month, for every year they are not in school, that will reshape the destiny of Afghanistan. It will reshape who leaves Afghanistan. It will reshape those who remain behind.
Can you see any areas where we can try to be hopeful about the future of Afghanistan, particularly for women and girls?
It's very difficult to see that right now. You see that so many women and girls have had to flee Afghanistan because of their participation in education, their leadership in education, their activism meant as soon as the Taliban came back into power, they were at increased and grave risk. And so many have fled. For those that are left behind, they face a daily risk. For many of them, they are at home unable to study or work. They've basically been immobilised. So it is difficult to see a way forward. That said, I think that we are seeing incredibly impressive leadership and incredibly impressive efforts despite those conditions. But the abrogation of responsibility by the international community has meant that they are incredibly isolated by the community of nations that has abandoned them. What we are now working on is the mobilisation of civil society around the world to attempt to support them in whatever ways that are meaningful. But there are very genuine prospects of famine as they head into the depths of this winter. You've got an economy that has entirely collapsed. So it is difficult to see that way forward. It is not impossible, but we are now most likely at best facing years, more likely decades and generations until we see a genuine change.
Here's Natasha Stott Despoja.
Tell us your take on what's happening in Afghanistan, particularly for women and girls. Do you have any hope for the situation there?
Look, I'm hopeful, and I guess something that gives me hope, although I'm disheartened, hopeful in the sense that look at the agency and the bravery and the strength of people in that country, but particularly women who have challenged, who have spoken out. Not only the women who are now expats in other parts of the world. I mean, some of the extraordinary politicians or former politicians who are speaking out in the international context. The fact that we're talking about it is important. The fact that you are seeing some action from countries specifically, or the multilateral framework generally. I guess, though, the worry that I have is that this is one of the single biggest and particular attacks on the rights of women and girls in particular that we've seen in a long, long time. And, I think the UN Secretary General has warned that this is symptomatic of what is happening with women's rights around the world. Because in the midst of, a global pandemic, which has done us no favours either when it comes to the exacerbation of sort of gender stereotypes and roles, we've got some real problems. So when you say hope, I want to have hope. And that's why I get involved in, different agencies in the hope that we will see change. But we are scrutinising very, very closely. And there are important recommendations that have been made, not only around ceasefires and, provision of support and reinstating, human rights and women's rights. I have to have hope, but this one really, it's really challenged me, to be honest.
Mm. You mentioned that just remarkable statistic about the decrease of women by 5%, correlating with an increase of 5 times the amount of perhaps going into conflict. I wondered if you've got any evidence of the reverse, that when countries, nation states, communities invest in women and girls, we see an increase in safety and security.
Absolutely. There are examples around the world where not only if you have, I mean, it is proven apparently that if you have, greater gender equality, you are less likely to see that kind of civil conflict or violence, let alone violence against or among other countries. I guess what I find fascinating too is that when we are talking about peace agreements, and as you would know, it was only 20 years ago, really, or just over, that the United Nations Security Council came up with Landmark Resolution 1325, which for the first time acknowledged that unique role of women and girls in conflict. And it wasn't only about acknowledging the impact and the effects on women and girls as victims, but it was about recognizing their essential role as peace builders. And there's certainly evidence around that. The peace agreements that have been struck that have involved women not only at the table, but civil society, etc., they've been more successful. And we've seen, even in our region, the extraordinary role of women in, say, Solomon Islands, places like that, Mindanao, these examples of trying to resolve conflict in those countries have been aided and abetted, if not led by women. So there's definitely plenty of research out there that suggests it. So it makes you wonder, doesn't it? Why aren't we, seeking to reflect more equally, or at least with some degree of parity in all our institutions around the world, the role of women in particular. So it staggers me. Even in our country, I don't understand why we are so far behind the rest of the world now in so many respects. We're 50th in the world when it comes to representation of women in parliaments. And, we're 30 times behind our nearest, neighbour, New Zealand. I mean, that's extraordinary to me after such world-leading, really pioneering progress that we made more than a century ago. So it can happen anywhere.
What is a feminist foreign policy?
Oh, I love the F word in foreign policy. When I was Ambassador for Women and Girls, I had that role between 2013 and 2016 in Australia. And I used to have what I called a title envy, because some of my colleagues and counterparts, particularly from, Sweden and Finland, the really show-offy countries. No, I'm kidding. They were all ambassadors for a feminist foreign policy. And I thought, I really want that. But Australia wasn't then quite ready for it. I would argue, perhaps not ready for it yet. But essentially, Lowy Institute and others, when we talk about a feminist foreign policy, it's defined as, having a foreign policy in which no action, no program, no project can proceed without understanding its impact on and effect on women and girls, but also making sure that any of those things contribute to increased gender equality. So, in fact, in many ways, believe it or not, Australia's foreign policy, when it comes to international development and foreign policy, does really centre gender in its policy. But we're not quite brave enough to call it feminist yet. I hope that will change.
To the average person, average Australian listening at home to this that might want to support the women of Afghanistan, but also help to sort of advocate for increased gender equality in international relations, although you do make the good point that we've got work to do at home as well. Yeah. What advice would you give to someone that does want to help or contribute in some way?
Oh, look, my answer when people ask what they can do is always really quite simple, and that is just do something. Have informed discussions, contact your local community to see if you can assist, be that with, voluntary work or donations, or indeed the literal assisting of refugees in this day and age. I think the greatest thing I would like to see from the community is a bit more momentum, and there has been recently, I can't deny that, and it makes me really happy, but more momentum around changing Australia's heinous laws in relation not only to detention, but, the fact that I think we've committed to take 3,000 refugees from Afghanistan, and that initial recruitment was not in addition to our annual humanitarian intake. It was as part of it.
Mhm.
And our intakes are so low. So I'd love to see more of a discussion and a debate and momentum build around changing these laws, because they've been, I don't know, the bane of my existence since I was in politics and had to, I was leader during the Tampa crisis. And, that was a watershed moment and changed community perceptions as well as public policy in the most deleterious way. So people can, you can lobby, you can donate, you can work on these issues, you can get involved in organisations, be they, United Nations refugee work, or whether it's the Australian Refugee Association. There are many others, refugee asylum support centres, etc. But I do think we need to change those laws at the very, very top end.
An emerging theme we keep coming across on What Happens Next is the imperative of including diverse voices from all walks of life, of all genders, all ages, all identities in decision making. Whether it's at a smaller scale, such as making changes around your neighbourhood so that it's safer and friendlier to fight loneliness, or at a larger scale, such as including women in international peacebuilding processes, the evidence shows again and again that we need a range of voices to change our world for the better. Thank you to our guests on this series, Parisa Secondari, Professor Jackie True, Professor Sharon Pickering and Natasha Stott Despoja AO. And thank you too for joining us for Season 6 of What Happens Next. This is the final episode of our season. We'll be back in a few short months with a new series investigating new challenges and how each of us can make a difference. In the meantime, be sure to explore our back catalogue of episodes on your favourite podcast app. You can also dig deeper into many of the topics we've covered in this season by visiting Monash Lens at lens.monash.edu. Do you have a topic you'd like us to examine in Season 7? We'd love to hear from you. Email podcasts@monash.edu with your idea. You can also leave us feedback, the good kind only please, by rating and reviewing What Happens Next on your preferred podcast platform. You'll find only the 5-star button works, don't take it up with us. It helps us improve and it helps listeners like you discover the show. In the meantime, be sure to explore our back catalogue of episodes such as right-wing extremism, hustle culture, the future of comedy and psychedelics for mental health. Thank you also to the Monash University Performing Arts Centre's David Lee Sound Gallery, where a portion of this season was recorded. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you on the next season of What Happens Next.